It's early summer of 1781, and more than 6 years have elapsed since the first shots of the American Revolutionary War were fired in Boston. After an extensive stalemate that had stretched for nearly 3 years, the tensions are mounting once more. British General Charles Cornwallis, after suffering multiple setbacks in his southern campaign, has dug in at Yorktown in the colony of Virginia with more than 7,000 men, supplied and reinforced by General Henry Clinton, stationed in New York City. At the same time, General George Washington, with his American force, met with his ally, French General Rochambeau, and his French host at White Plains, just 30 miles north of New York City. Their united army numbered up to 16,000 men, outnumbering Clinton 3-1. There, Washington and his senior officers discussed their future plans with Rochambeau, and they were tasked with making the difficult decision of where to strike next. Washington pointed out that, due to their numerical advantage, they should retake New York City, where he had fought a shameful defeat 5 years ago. Rochambeau disagreed, however, saying that attacking New York City would not only be difficult but costly, and pointed towards striking Cornwallis at Yorktown, which was a much easier target. Their assault on Yorktown by land could additionally be aided by an attack from the sea, since French Admiral de Grasse was sailing north along the coast with an extensive fleet towards the Chesapeake Bay. Washington, though eager to retake New York City, nonetheless agreed to a united attack on Yorktown. In mid-August, after a month of preparations, he departed New York with Rochambeau, along with 3,000 American soldiers and 4,000 French regulars, while more would join them on the way. Many men, however, were left behind in southern New York to defend the Hudson River Valley against the British in New York City. To decoy the British and to keep their destination a secret, Washington sent out fake dispatches which fell into the hands of Clinton, saying that he wished to attack New York City. This caused the British to have no indication that Cornwallis was in grave danger. Meanwhile, as the joint army led by Washington was on the march south towards Yorktown, Admiral de Grasse had arrived in Chesapeake Bay with 24 ships of the line, ready to block off Cornwallis by sea. However, a British relief force dispatched from New York City by Clinton was drawing near to de Grasse's fleet anchored in the Chesapeake Bay to break the French blockade by sea. This force consisted of 19 ships of the line, commanded by British Admiral Thomas Graves. Early on September 5th, the British arrived at the mouth of the bay, and de Grasse quickly assembled his ships to sail out and meet the enemy. After hours of maneuvering from both sides, a 2-hour-long engagement took place, which was known as the Battle of the Chesapeake. Not all the ships from both fleets were engaged in battle, but still the clash was an immensely fierce one. The British, though inferior in number and strength, held their own against the French fleet, but by the end of 2 hours, Graves had suffered many times more casualties than de Grasse, and decided to withdraw, ending the battle. The French fleet continued to shadow the British for several days afterwards, before at length breaking off on the 13th of September and sailing back to the Chesapeake to continue its blockade. Graves, meanwhile, returned to New York City for reinforcements, but neither he nor his fleet would play any major role for the rest of the Yorktown campaign. On September 14th, Washington arrived in Williamsburg, Virginia, with his army, and there he studied the British positions in Yorktown nearby. The city, having been built on the banks of the York River, could only be surrounded on 3 sides by land, and it was anchored by British ships in the river. Across the narrow waterway was a peninsula called Gloucester Point, which was controlled by British forces as well, and could act as an escape route for the Redcoats if the battle turned ill against them. To protect Yorktown against an attack by land, Cornwallis had ordered the digging of multiple redoubts and other fortifications long before. A tight belt of deep trenches ran on the outskirts of Yorktown, manned by many redcoats and many more cannon, while multiple square redoubts, reinforced by earthen walls, were built in a rough line farther out. These were occupied heavily as well, and any attacking army would have to clear them one by one before assaulting the city directly. In total, Cornwallis had over 7,000 men to defend Yorktown, and they each were veteran Redcoats and Hessians, or British-hired German troops. Washington and Rochambeau marched out from Williamsburg on the 28th of September and moved into position to completely surround Yorktown. Washington, with his 9,000 Continental soldiers, dug in on the Allied right flank, while Rochambeau, with his 7,000 French soldiers, marched into position on the left flank. Meanwhile, additional French and American troops were stationed at Gloucester Point to hold the British soldiers encamped there and to prevent Cornwallis from evacuating across the river. Over the next 2 days, Washington and Rochambeau slowly advanced forward, exchanging fire with British soldiers and continuing to bombard Cornwallis's defenses. Little damage was done during this time to either side, however, and Washington continued to plan the attack with his officers and with his French allies. Cornwallis soon received a letter from Henry Clinton back in New York, saying that 5,000 reinforcements were promised to arrive soon in Yorktown, and that Admiral Graves was preparing to sail south again to Chesapeake Bay. After due consideration, Cornwallis decided to tighten his lines and pulled back from all of his outer defenses, save for the 9th and 10th redoubts on his left flank and the Fusilier redoubt on his right flank. The Americans and the French continued to press forward, occupying the abandoned British fortifications, and dug additional redoubts to fill the gaps and to solidify their lines. In the meanwhile, Washington and Rochambeau met to discuss their plans, and they decided, after much observation, that the British in Yorktown could be bombarded into submission. To set up their cannon so that they could fire straight into the city, however, long straight trenches called parallels had to be dug, more than a mile closer to the outskirts of Yorktown, and with British redoubts and entrenched redcoats nearby, ready to pour volleys into any enemy that came within the range of their guns, digging effective parallels was not an easy task. Preparations for digging the long trench nonetheless began swiftly, and by the 6th of October all was ready. That night, under the cover of darkness, French and American troops moved out swiftly and silently to the marked path of the redoubt, with a full moon above them veiled by black storm clouds. Washington ceremonially struck the first blows of the parallel into the soil, and the strenuous work began. The trench was planned to be over 2,000 yards long, running from the York River all the way to the main road leading into Yorktown, and it would take all night for the construction to be completed. Meanwhile, to keep the British occupied elsewhere, the French launched a diversionary attack from the left flank and kept the eyes of the redcoats riveted upon them for many hours before withdrawing. The French and Americans labored on through the night, digging into the dirt and the wet sand, and struggling to keep a steady pace. Tensions, meanwhile, mounted high in the Allied camp, for the outcome of the entire battle could be decided by the success or the failure of digging the parallel trench. Would Washington and Rochambeau's men successfully complete this strenuous task? Dawn alone will unveil the answer.